Most emergency calls follow a familiar pattern. There's panic, urgency, and usually a clear problem that needs an immediate response. But some calls don't follow that pattern at all. Some calls feel wrong from the very first second. This is one of them. It was just after 2:17 a.m. when the phone rang inside a 911 dispatch center in the United States. The night had been quiet. The operators were alert but relaxed, expecting nothing more than routine emergencies. For them, this was supposed to be just another call. At least, that's what they believed at the time. The line connected, and the operator answered in her trained, professional tone. 911, what's your emergency? There was no immediate reply, no screaming, no crying, no frantic request for help. Instead, there was only breathing. Heavy, uneven breathing, the kind that sounds like someone has been running or desperately trying to stay quiet. The operator waited a moment and then spoke again, asking if the caller could hear her. Still, there were no words, only breathing. Then, faintly, another sound could be heard in the background. It was low and subtle, almost easy to miss, like something slowly being dragged across the floor. The operator straightened in her chair. She told herself that calls sometimes begin this way. People freeze, people panic. She tried again, calmly telling the caller she was there to help and asking him to explain what was happening. Several seconds passed before a voice finally came through the line. Hello? The word was quiet and unstable, as if it took effort just to say it. The operator responded immediately, assuring him she could hear him and asking what his emergency was. The caller hesitated. When he finally spoke, his sentence was simple. He said he thought someone was inside his house. Those words are not unusual for a 911 operator. Calls about break-ins happen every day. But there was something different about the way he said it. There was no anger and no shouting, only fear. Pure, controlled fear. The operator kept her voice calm and asked if he was in a safe place. The caller answered that he didn't know. That response concerned her. She asked for his address, and when he gave it, the system showed a remote location with very little nearby activity. She told him help was being dispatched and asked him to stay on the line. Immediately, the caller begged her not to hang up. There was desperation in his voice now. She asked if he was alone in the house. There was a long pause before he answered. He said that he was, past tense. The operator questioned him, asking what he meant by that. The caller didn't answer right away. Instead, his breathing became faster and shakier. Then he said that whatever had been making noise before had stopped. The operator asked what he meant by that. The caller said he didn't know, only that it had been walking earlier. When she asked him what she meant by it, there was another pause. Then, very quietly, he said that it stopped moving when he called 911. At that moment, the operator signaled to her supervisor. Something about the call felt deeply wrong. She continued asking questions, trying to keep the caller calm and focused. She asked where he was inside the house. He told her he was locked inside the bathroom. She told him that was good and instructed him to stay there. Then the caller said something that made the room go still. He told her he could hear breathing. The operator asked whose breathing he was hearing, but the caller didn't respond. The line remained open, and now two distinct sounds could be heard. One was the caller's breathing, fast and panicked. The other was slower, controlled, and clearly not his. The operator lowered her voice and told him help was on the way, urging him to stay with her. Then there was a faint sound, so quiet it almost didn't register, like someone standing very close to the phone. The caller whispered that it knew where he was. After that, there was silence. The call did not disconnect. There was no static, just silence. This was the moment investigators would later focus on, the moment they realized this was not a normal emergency call. because whatever was happening on the other end of that line had already gone too far. And this was only the beginning.
In the hours after the call ended, the 911 dispatch center returned to its routine. Phones rang, reports were filed. Other emergencies took priority. But for the operator who took that call, something felt unfinished. The line had not disconnected naturally, there was no confirmation of safety, and there was no clear explanation for what she had heard. When responding officers arrived at the address provided by the caller, they found the house completely silent. No lights were on, no signs of forced entry were immediately visible. From the outside, everything looked normal, too normal. The front door was locked, windows were intact, there was no movement inside. Police announced themselves and entered the home carefully. Room by room they searched. The living room was undisturbed. The kitchen showed no signs of a struggle. Nothing appeared broken or out of place. But when they reached the bathroom at the end of the hallway, they noticed something strange. The bathroom door was locked from the inside. Officers forced the door open, expecting to find the caller hiding inside, but the bathroom was empty. There was no one there, no body, no injured person, no sign of anyone having been inside recently. The room was clean, dry, untouched. The only thing out of place was the phone. It was lying on the bathroom floor, still connected. The call had never been ended. At first, investigators assumed there had to be a simple explanation. Perhaps the caller had escaped through another door. Perhaps he had been mistaken. Perhaps fear had caused him to imagine things that were not there. But those explanations began to fall apart almost immediately. There were no other exits from the bathroom. The window was small and unopened. There were no footprints, no fingerprints, no signs of a struggle anywhere in the house. It was as if the person who made the call had simply vanished. The 911 recording was reviewed multiple times that night. Supervisors listened carefully. Investigators listened even more closely. The call itself raised several questions that no one could easily answer. Why did the caller say he was no longer alone if there was no evidence of another person? Why did the background audio contain sounds that did not match the environment? And most unsettling of all, whose breathing was heard on the line? Audio analysts slowed the recording down. They isolated the background noise. What they found made the situation worse. The second breathing sound was not interference. It was not static. It was not feedback. It was distinct, consistent, and independent from the caller's voice. There were two sources of breathing on that call. Only one person was ever confirmed to have been on the line. The operator who took the call was interviewed later that morning. She described an overwhelming sense of dread during the final moments of the conversation. She said it felt like someone else was listening, like the caller was no longer alone, even though he was locked in a small room with nowhere to go. She also stated something that troubled investigators deeply. Near the end of the call, just before the silence began, she thought she heard movement that did not come from the caller. Something subtle, something close. That detail was never officially included in the final report. The case was initially classified as an unexplained disappearance. Missing person alerts were prepared. Nearby areas were searched. Canine units were brought in, but the dogs struggled to track a scent. It was faint, confused, almost as if it ended inside the house. Neighbors were interviewed. None reported hearing screams. None saw anyone leave the property. No vehicles were reported in the area at the time of the call. No security cameras captured anything unusual. The caller had no known enemies, no history of mental illness, no criminal background. Friends and family described him as cautious, intelligent, and calm under pressure. This was not someone known to panic or fabricate stories. As days passed, the investigation stalled. There was no physical evidence to follow, no suspects, no clear timeline after the call ended. The case quietly began to collect dust, but the recording never did. Investigators who reviewed the call years later would all say the same thing. The fear in the caller's voice was not imagined. It was not exaggerated. It was the kind of fear that comes from certainty, not confusion, from knowing something is wrong and realizing it may already be too late. Some investigators also pointed out a chilling detail that most people miss. Throughout the call, the operator asked direct questions. The caller answered most of them clearly, but whenever the operator asked what the presence actually was, the caller avoided describing it. He never said a person. He never said a man. He never said someone. He always said it. That choice of word was never explained. The case file eventually closed without resolution. Officially, the disappearance remains unsolved. Unofficially, the call became something else entirely. It became one of those recordings that dispatchers warn each other about, the kind they don't play for new recruits, the kind that stays with you long after you hear it. One senior investigator later said that some cases haunt you because of what you see, others haunt you because of what you hear. This one, he said, was worse, because the most disturbing part of the call wasn't the fear, it wasn't the silence, it was the feeling that whatever was on the other end of the line never needed to speak, and that the caller may not have been the only one listening.
Before investigators could understand what happened during the call, they needed to understand who made it. The caller was a man in his early 30s, employed full-time, with no criminal history and no record of mental illness. He lived alone by choice, not isolation. Friends described him as practical, quiet, and detail-oriented. He was not known to exaggerate or panic, especially in stressful situations. The house where the call originated had been his home for just under a year. It sat on the edge of a sparsely populated area, surrounded by trees and long, unlit roads. The property was not abandoned or run down. It was well maintained, recently inspected, and showed no history of break-ins or disturbances. Neighbors, though distant, reported nothing unusual in the weeks leading up to the incident. Investigators noted that the caller had followed a normal routine that evening. Phone records showed no distress calls prior to 911. There were no alarming messages sent to friends or family. His last outgoing communication before the emergency call was a short text earlier that night, casual and unremarkable. Nothing in his digital footprint suggested fear, paranoia, or expectation of danger. Inside the house, officers found evidence of a normal night interrupted. A half-finished drink sat on the kitchen counter. The television was off, but still warm. Shoes were left near the door, as if he had planned to stay inside. There were no signs of a struggle anywhere in the home. No overturned furniture, no broken glass, no forced entry. The locks were intact, and the alarm system had not been triggered. This raised a troubling question. If no one broke in, why did the caller believe someone was inside the house? The layout of the home was carefully examined. From the living area to the bathroom, there were only a few narrow hallways. Anyone moving through the house would have been heard clearly, yet neighbors reported no noise, and the caller himself never described footsteps in detail. He only said that something had been walking before it stopped. Investigators reviewed the timeline again and again. According to the call duration and dispatch logs, only a short window existed between the moment the caller locked himself in the bathroom and the moment officers arrived. There was not enough time for a person to enter the house, hide, abduct the caller, and leave without leaving a trace. And yet, the caller was gone. Family members were questioned about the caller's past experiences. There were no reports of sleepwalking, hallucinations, or substance use. Toxicology reports found nothing unusual. Medical history revealed no conditions that could explain confusion or auditory distortions. The man had never reported hearing voices or seeing things that weren't there. That left investigators with the possibility they were reluctant to consider, that the caller was fully aware of what he was experiencing. Attention returned to the 911 recording. Analysts noticed how controlled the caller remained during most of the conversation. His breathing was heavy, but his words were deliberate. He answered questions logically. He followed instructions. This was not someone in a panic spiral. This was someone reacting to a specific and immediate threat. One detail stood out more than any other. At no point did the caller attempt to confront whatever he believed was inside the house. He did not shout. He did not demand that it leave. He hid. He locked himself in a small room and whispered. That behavior suggested fear of something he did not believe could be reasoned with. Investigators also noticed that the caller never asked who was in his house. He never said he thought it was a burglar or an intruder. He didn't describe footsteps, voices, or movement that could be clearly human. His language remained vague, almost careful, as if naming it would make things worse. Inside the house itself offered no answers. There were no signs of a struggle and no evidence that the caller had been forcibly removed. The locked door showed no damage beyond what officers caused when they forced it open. The phone was found on the floor near the sink, as if it had been dropped rather than placed down. That suggested the call ended suddenly and without intention. Search teams expanded their efforts in the days that followed. Nearby woods were combed, roads were checked, water sources were examined. Nothing was found. No clothing, no phone fragments, no trace of the caller beyond the walls of his own home. As the investigation continued, pressure grew to find a rational explanation. But every explanation raised more questions. If the caller left voluntarily, why take nothing? If he was abducted, how did no one see or hear anything? And if he imagined the threat, why did the audio recording suggest otherwise? One investigator later admitted that the case became difficult not because of what they couldn't prove, but because of what they couldn't disprove. Every logical explanation required ignoring at least one undeniable fact: the locked door, the second breathing sound, the vanished caller. By the end of the third week, the case had no clear direction. Leads dried up, search efforts slowed, and slowly the focus shifted away from finding a person and towards understanding a moment captured on a recording that refused to make sense. Because the deeper investigators looked into the caller's life, the more one thing became clear. There was nothing in his past that explained what he experienced that night, which meant whatever caused that 911 call did not come from his mind. It came from inside the house. As the investigation stalled, attention returned again and again to the 911 recording, not as evidence in the traditional sense, but as the only remaining witness to what had happened inside that house. Investigators listened to it repeatedly, each time focusing on different details. The words themselves were troubling, but it was the spaces between them that raised the most concern. When the audio was cleaned and enhanced, subtle sounds became more noticeable. Faint movements, soft shifts in pressure, noises that were too deliberate to be dismissed as random interference. These sounds appeared at moments when the caller stopped speaking, as if something else was active only when he was quiet. One analyst pointed out that the background noise did not remain constant throughout the call. It changed. Early on, the house sounded empty. Later, the acoustics shifted slightly, as though something had moved closer to the phone. The sound did not resemble footsteps or common household noise. It was heavier, slower, measured. Investigators also noticed that the caller's behavior changed in response to these sounds. At first, he spoke in full sentences. As the call continued, his answers became shorter. His voice dropped. He began whispering, even when the operator asked him to speak up. That behavior suggested proximity. The closer the sound became, the quieter the caller grew. Another unsettling detail emerged during a careful review of the breathing captured on the call. The second breathing pattern did not align with normal human rhythm. It was too steady, too controlled. It lacked the natural variations caused by stress or exertion. This breathing remained calm even as the caller's panic increased. At one point in the recording, the caller stopped answering questions entirely. For several seconds, only breathing could be heard. Then, faintly, there was a sound similar to fabric brushing against fabric. It was not loud enough to identify, but it was close, too close. Investigators debated whether the caller could have been experiencing an auditory illusion, but that explanation failed when analysts confirmed that the second breathing track was present independently of the caller's voice. It was not echo, it was not feedback, it was not distortion caused by poor signal quality. It was something else. What disturbed investigators most was the timing. The breathing grew clearer only after the caller said it had stopped making noise. Whatever he had heard moving earlier was no longer walking. It was no longer dragging across the floor. It was stationary, listening. The caller's final clear statement was examined frame by frame. When he whispered that it knew where he was, his voice showed no confusion. There was no question in his tone. He wasn't guessing, he was stating a conclusion. That realization changed the way the call was viewed. This was not a man afraid of the unknown. This was a man who believed he had been discovered. Investigators also questioned why the caller never attempted to flee the house once he locked himself in the bathroom. There were other exits, windows, back doors, but instead of running, he stayed. That decision suggested that leaving the room may have felt more dangerous than remaining inside it. Several officers later admitted that they began imagining the scenario from the caller's perspective, sitting in a locked bathroom, hearing something breathe just outside the door, knowing help was on the way, but not knowing if it would arrive in time. That mental image stayed with them long after the case went cold. Another troubling observation came from a technical specialist who reviewed the call logs. The phone never lost signal. There were no interruptions, no sudden drops in audio quality. The call ended in silence, not because the connection failed, but because no one was speaking anymore. That raised a final, disturbing question. If the caller had been taken or attacked, why was there no sound of struggle, no sudden movement, no raised voice? The silence was too complete. Some investigators theorized that the caller may have been immobilized. Others suggested that whatever was present did not need force. Neither explanation was comforting. As weeks turned into months, the call began to affect those who worked on the case. More than one investigator reported difficulty sleeping after reviewing the recording. A few requested reassignment. One dispatcher asked not to be scheduled for night shifts anymore. No one ever said it officially, but the fear was shared. The sense that the call represented something beyond a crime, something that did not fit into procedures or protocols. The recording was eventually restricted, not sealed, but quietly set aside. It was no longer used for training. It was no longer discussed openly. It became one of those cases people referenced indirectly, lowering their voices when it came up. Because the more you listened to the call, the harder it became to ignore one possibility, that the caller was not dealing with an intruder, not a burglar, not even a person. He was dealing with a presence. And whatever that presence was, it did not rush. It did not panic.
The final seconds of the 911 call were analyzed more than any other part of the recording. Investigators believed that if there was any moment where the truth revealed itself, it was there. What they found did not bring clarity. It only deepened the fear. In the last minute of the call, the operator continued speaking, but the caller stopped responding. His breathing was still present at first, shallow and uneven, as if he were trying not to make any sound. Then, slowly, even that began to fade. What replaced it was something far more unsettling. The second breathing sound became clearer. It was no longer distant. It was no longer faint. It sounded close to the phone, closer than the caller's own voice had been earlier. Audio specialists later noted that the sound carried a depth and steadiness inconsistent with someone under stress. It did not rush. It did not stutter. It was calm, almost deliberate. The operator asked the caller to speak. She asked him to make any sound at all. There was no reply. For several seconds, the only thing audible on the line was that slow breathing. Investigators would later describe this portion of the recording as unbearable to listen to. Then something changed. There was a brief sound, lasting less than a second, a subtle noise, like a shift in weight or a slight movement very near the phone. Not loud enough to identify, but clear enough to confirm proximity. Whatever was producing the sound was no longer outside the bathroom. It was at the door, or possibly inside. After that moment, the breathing stopped. Not gradually, instantly. What followed was silence. No struggle, no cry for help, no sound of the phone hitting the floor. Just silence. The operator stayed on the line, repeating the caller's name, urging him to respond. The call timer continued running. The line remained open, but there was nothing on the other end. That silence lasted until responding officers reached the house and physically ended the call themselves. Investigators questioned whether the caller could have dropped the phone and moved away, but the audio did not support that theory. There was no change in distance, no fading, no muffling. The sound simply ceased, as if it had been intentionally removed from the line. This detail alone troubled analysts deeply. Even more disturbing was what was missing. In cases of violence, recordings almost always capture something unexpected. A gasp, a sound of impact, a sudden exhale. None of that existed here. The absence of noise suggested control, precision, restraint. When investigators reconstructed the timeline, they realized that the last audible sound on the call occurred nearly a full minute before officers arrived. That meant whatever happened to the caller occurred while help was already on the way. He had been close to being saved. That fact haunted everyone involved. One senior analyst later stated that the final silence felt intentional, as though the call ended not because something went wrong, but because something decided it was finished. That statement was never included in any official documentation. Another chilling detail emerged during advanced audio review. When the silence was amplified, faint background noise could still be detected, electrical hum, ambient room tone, but there was no sign of movement, no breathing, no presence of the caller. It was as if the room itself was empty, yet investigators knew the caller had been there moments earlier. The idea that unsettled them most was not that something attacked the caller, but that whatever was present may not have needed to, that it may have simply intervened in a way that left no physical trace and no audible struggle. Several investigators admitted privately that the final seconds of the call felt wrong in a way they couldn't explain. Not chaotic, not violent, just controlled, as if the outcome had already been decided before the caller ever dialed 911. Years later, those who listened to the recording for the first time reported the same reaction, a deep sense of unease, followed by a question they could never fully answer. At what exact moment did the caller stop being alone? Because by the time the call ended, there was no evidence that he was there at all, and whatever had been listening on the other end of that line had vanished just as completely.
In the years that followed, the case officially remained unsolved. There was no arrest, no recovery, and no explanation that satisfied investigators. The caller was eventually declared missing, not deceased, because there was no evidence of a crime scene. No blood, no struggle, no sign of violence, just absence.
The house was sold months later. New owners moved in after a routine inspection found nothing unusual. They were never told about the call. Investigators believed it was better that way. Some stories, they felt, served no purpose once they were known. But the recording remained. It stayed archived in a secure system, rarely accessed and never shared publicly in full. New investigators were warned about it, not because it was graphic, but because of how it made people feel. Those who listened to it often reported the same reaction, a growing sense that something was wrong long before anything actually happened. One detail continued to disturb analysts more than any other. During the call, the operator had asked several direct questions. The caller answered almost all of them, but there was one question he never answered. When asked if he could see what was inside the house, the caller went silent. That silence lasted longer than any other pause in the call, longer than moments of fear, longer than moments of confusion. And after it ended, his voice was noticeably lower, almost resigned, as if seeing something had changed his understanding of the situation entirely. That moment was never explained. Years later, a senior investigator revisited the case one final time before retiring. He listened to the recording with fresh ears, focusing not on the sounds, but on the structure of the conversation. He noticed something that no one had officially documented before. The caller never once asked for police. He never asked for officers to arrive quickly. He never asked to be rescued. He never asked what he should do if the door opened. He only asked the operator not to hang up. That detail suggested something unsettling, that the caller may not have believed help could change what was happening, that the call was not a request for rescue, but a way to not be alone in his final moments. Another investigator noted something equally disturbing. The second breathing sound never returned after the silence began. Whatever had been present did not linger. It did not wait. It did not continue listening. It left, which raised a final question no one could answer. If the caller was taken, where did he go? And if he wasn't taken, what exactly ended the call so completely? Over time, the case stopped being discussed in meetings and reports, but it continued to circulate quietly among dispatchers and investigators, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a reminder that not every emergency fits into a category, and not every call ends the way it should. Some dispatchers say that once you've heard the recording, you listen to calls differently. You pay closer attention to breathing, to silence, to the things callers don't say. Because sometimes the most terrifying part of an emergency call isn't the panic, it's the calm. And sometimes the most haunting cases are not the ones where something is heard screaming into the phone, but the ones where something is listening. This call was never about what the operator heard. It was about what the caller realized, and by the time anyone else understood it, it was already too late.